Hello, welcome to The Conversation on New Central Television. This is the program where we bring you up to speed with all the political happenings on the African continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa.
And I am Rita Omodia. And right now, on today's edition of The Conversation, we will be analysing the Climate Change Summit held in Netherlands on Monday, in which African leaders have expressed disappointment about wealthy nations not showing up at the meeting.
We will also go to Zambia, where President Hakainde Hichilema has denied involvement in the arrest of the opposition politician, Sean Tembo.
I mean, these are two serious issues here. The issue of climate change, this has been the topic we've been hearing over and over again. And it's quite unfortunate that European leaders were not physically present at the meeting.
Yes, and when you look at this, Africa produces just 4% of global greenhouse gases, but we are the ones that feel the adverse effects of climate change. So it's very important. It's a matter of life and death and the economy and food. So I look forward to the conversation we'll be having on it. But first, let's begin with the Africa Adaptation Summit, which was held in the Dutch port city of Rotterdam, which comes 2 months before the crucial COP27 climate change conference in Egypt in November. African leaders at the summit have, however, expressed disappointment and criticized the Western countries for not showing up at the meeting, where they're hoping to raise pledges of some $250 million in capital to attract investors in adaptation programs. The Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte was the only one who showed up in the summit in person, as he was the host.
Meanwhile, Senegalese President and African Union Chief Macky Sall and Congolese President Félix Tshisekedi said wealthy countries responsible for most CO2 emissions should have been there. The summit, the first to focus on helping Africa adapt to the fallout from climate change, brings together the African Union, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the Netherlands-based Global Center on Adaptation. Now, Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank, says Africa did not even contribute to 3% of gas emissions, but suffered greatly, and the continent is greatly distressed by climate change. Let's take a look at this.
I think the Center for Global Center on Adaptation is doing an incredible job getting the world to focus on the world's most vulnerable countries that did not cause the climate change that we all face today. And nowhere is that more important than in Africa. Africa does not contribute for more than 3% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, but it suffers disproportionately from its negative consequences. Think about it. I'm not going to worry you about the figures. The figures are well known, but I want to talk to you about what it means in the lives of people. Take a look at farmers today in Africa. From East Africa, they haven't had rains in 2 years. And that means that pastoralists are losing all of their livestock. That is actually their own savings. That's the assets that they have. It means that women cannot actually feed their kids. It means that you have significant amount of stunting and malnutrition as a result of that. And in fact, in the case of Africa, if you take West Africa, for example, stunting.
Now, joining us to discuss all of this and more is Stephen Buchanan-Clarke, as the head of Human Security and Climate Change Program at Good Governance Africa, Cape Town, South Africa. And we also have Olumide Idowu, climate activist and executive coordinator of AYICC Africa. He joins us live from Lagos, Nigeria. Gentlemen, welcome to The Conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I'd like to start with you, Stephen. The world is experiencing some of the most extreme weather patterns, from floods to heat waves. Africa has been responsible for less than 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's by far the most vulnerable region to the effects of climate change. Just how bad is the situation in Africa?
Well, unfortunately, it really is at crisis levels. Just over the last 2 years, we've seen 30 million Africans slip into extreme levels of poverty owing to food security challenges. And that's in large part due to climate change impacts. As we saw head of the AU, President Macky Sall mention, in East Africa has seen significant flooding. in some parts, while other parts have seen significant droughts over a long 2-year period. And we've seen, as a result of this, massive levels of food insecurity and accompanying malnutrition. So it is a dire situation, I would say, and it is thus is very unfortunate presentation at the African Adaptation Forum in Rotterdam.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen. I can imagine just how unfortunate it is. I mean, earlier on, we saw the report from the AFDB president, Akinmi Adesina, talking about how this threat is so much affecting Africa. Now, I want you to accentuate on this, Olumide, because the AFDB president talked about raising up to $4 to $13 billion to curb this climate change. Now, how does this threat of climate change manifest itself in Africa?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I just want to quickly take us back to a very quick, important thing that we need to understand. When we are organizing a conference to address the issue of climate change for African region, we need to understand that that conversation needs to happen on the land where such effect is actually happening, so that these people will be able to see the reflection of what we are actually going through. A lot of promises have been made, thanks to the president of African Development Bank, stressing the fact that we are not even contributing in, the people contributing are actually the ones that need to pay for this. 2019, the 10 billion package, where is it up to today? Everybody is talking about climate finance for adaptation, mitigation, loss, and damage. So it's something that we need to start to ask ourselves. Are we really, or do we really need to continue to wait for these Western people, or do we need to make them to understand that the bilateral agreement or the conversation between us need to have a concrete conversation? Because climate change issue is not a joking issue, because it cuts across every sector. So such conference on adaptation going on in those kind of places will not really show them the need and the understanding of what is actually happening to us in Africa. And if you look at the geographical location where we are, there's sea level rise, there's flooding, there's wildlife issue. He even mentioned farmers, and which is a critical part in our food sovereignty. So it's very, very important that every promises, every bilateral agreement that always come up in every summit need to back up with a legal fact, so that by tomorrow, you and I, we have something that is backing up every promises that have been made for so-called Africa or any other entity that is making a promises on our behalf. Thank you.
Thank you, Olumide. Now, Stephen, Olumide said something quite poignant about the adaptation conference not happening on the continent that really needs it. Does it really matter if the meeting was held in Rotterdam or in Africa? As we know that the COP27 Climate Change Summit will be happening in 2 months' time in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Now, also, Senegalese President and African Union Chief Macky Sall and the Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi said wealthy countries responsible for most CO2 emissions should have been present at the conference. Do the world's worst polluters have a moral responsibility to help African nations adapt?
Well, absolutely. I think why this is concerning, and it is something my Nigerian colleague touched on, was that the history of pledges to international climate funding to help developing nations adapt to the impacts of climate change have been broken time and time again by developed nations. In 2009, developed nations pledged to raise 100 billion by 2020 to fund, in terms of international climate funding towards adaptation. This was missed by about 20 billion by 2020. It's estimated at least 10 billion a year is now needed to fund adaptation climate funding, and this is going to increase year on year throughout the decade as temperatures continue to warm. I think the fact that there was a lack of representation by developed nations, Western leaders in Rotterdam, in an area in close proximity to them, is particularly concerning, but not just Western political leaders, but also major private sector actors were not present at the forum, which is a major concern. We can perhaps charitably, in a sense, say that the war in Ukraine and as well as domestic issues within the US and within Western nations themselves fighting their own economic problems and economic downturns was one of the reasons.
Yes, Stephen,
yes, Stephen.
we're with you.
All right, while we stood, Stephen, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry,
okay, go on, please.
However, I think it's part of a longer trend of developed nations continually failing African countries when it comes to funding climate change adaptation programs. And as you say, I don't just believe it's a moral imperative. I think it is something that we need to frame as fundamentally in the best interests of developing nations. We know that climate change impacts have generate fragility and conflict, and this is something that has global impacts, as we've seen recently in the Ukraine-Russia war. So if we can frame this as Africans in the best interests of developing nations, I think it may help the situation. And also, I think more punitive measures have to be taken into account, perhaps incorporated into the Paris Agreement, to ensure that those developed nations that don't fulfill their climate pledges, actually, there's consequence for that. Thanks.
Okay, so looking at these measures you're talking about, we've had several climate conferences. I'm coming to Olumide right now. Now, the Africa Adaptation Summit comes 2 months before the crucial COP27 climate conference in Egypt in November. How much of the recommendations of COP26 or even the other climate conferences has been adopted? Because we have a number of skeptics that believe these conferences are just a talk shop with little action taken to fight climate change. And Stephen rightly said it. He talked about more measures, more penalties. What exactly has been done?
I just want to also say that it is not only adaptation summits that just happened. We just left Gabon for the African Climate Week. And one of the biggest issues that came up in that meeting was loss and damage. We also talk about climate finance. We also look at the critical aspects of what we call funding for adaptation issues. So after African Climate Week, then we move to adaptation summits. Do you see that, like what you said, do we need to continue to make this as a talk show? No. We need to start looking at what are the things that Africa prioritize and want to implement to improve. So that is the biggest issue we are having. And 2 months to come, is Africa also ready to put their priorities straight, to make sure that while we are going to COP, our African group of negotiators understand the roles of African governments and the head of state and the priority towards COP27. So it is very, very critical that we ourselves as an African continent, we need to look at our priority and who is the people that's going to be negotiating on our behalf. We have the African group of negotiators. So if we can strengthen these negotiators and power, even in country level focal point, then we'll be able to say to ourselves that we are going with a concrete recommendation, and the recommendation, like I said, need to back up legally so that we don't continue to go to the same conference the same year without having solid outcome. See, like what my other speakers mentioned, the 100 million climate finance money they've promised Africa. They are saying a lot about we don't have capacity, we don't have mechanism or capacity to access those funds. Do we continue to talk about accessibility to fund that is meant for vulnerable people, that is meant for local people that are suffering the impact of climate change? I think there are two things involved. Is either Africa is not ready to challenge this kind of conversation, or they themselves as continent and as Western region leaders are not actually telling us what we need to do as a change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olumide. Now, Stephen, I'd like to pick up from where Olumide stopped. When you have a country like the United States of America, which is one of the biggest global polluters and greenhouse emitters in the world that have contributed to global warming, just unilaterally, leaving the Paris Agreement, like former President Donald Trump did. Who does Africa hold accountable for pledges that have been made for climate financing? And like you said, Rotterdam is situated in Europe, so they're the people that matter in close proximity to this place, and they refuse to show up. And also, are the Paris Agreement and climate financing helping to cut global emissions? So let's look at it from COP26 to date. How much difference has it made? And is this just a talk shop? All these conferences and workshops?
Well, on your first point regarding the US, just recently the US passed the Inflation Reduction Act, because as you rightly pointed out, threats to leave the Paris Accord were very concerning. And I believe under the Trump administration did set back global climate change targets considerably. But we have seen a pivot under the Biden administration, and the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, which included $369 billion US, I believe, for the US to transform towards green industries, is very significant. I think it shows the US is getting a bit more serious about cutting its own emissions as the world's second biggest emitter after China. However, within that, Biden had originally talked about over $14 billion in international financing towards adaptation. Once the bill was passed, that had been stripped down to $1 billion. So we see just in that single case that political difficulties in passing bills that pledge international climate financing when countries have their own domestic issues of concern. However, I think to perhaps transform this more from, like you say, from talk shops to concerted action, the African Group of Climate Negotiators and African leaders have to get serious about willing to leverage their position to gain climate adaptation financing. And by that, I mean, if the United Nations and developed nations are asking us to transition to renewable energies, then they have to put the money on the table in order to make that a reality. If they want Africans to leave fossil fuels in the ground, then they have to make that a reality. Because as you said at the top of the show, the historical carbon emissions are overwhelmingly the result of developed nations. And if we are to, say, as a continent, skip that trajectory that developed nations have already gone through, then we need the climate finances to do that.
Okay, Olumide, what are your expectations? We have the COP27 happening in November in Egypt. What do you expect to be the outcome of this COP27 climate conference?
Yeah, thank you very much. For me personally, and looking at the side I'm coming from, for me, I think one of the biggest outcomes I'm looking for is how do we address loss and damage? It's very, very vital in the conversation I want to see in COP27. Secondly, the issue of climate finance is not, we don't need to start negotiating about it again. We need to start implementing. So all those financial mechanisms that they are telling us, all those opportunities for funding for adaptation need to start right now, because we cannot continue to promote or to push the funding that's supposed to go to local actors. And the international community need to also understand that there's a responsibility that lies in their hands to make sure that when they make promise ahead of every meeting we are attending, they should make sure that there is a follow-up on it. So African leaders, African group of negotiators, we need to start looking at loss and damage, climate finance, and adaptation issue as a very serious issue that we need to look at in COP27, so that by the time we come back home, we're now talking about implementation, not for us to start going back and start complaining and start talking about social money they promised, or the Glasgow Compact has stated a lot of indicators that we need to look at as an African continent. The Paris Agreement has laid down some processes. The nationally determined contribution, the NDC, every country have their own indicators that need to be achieved. So how are we making sure that all these things is not just a talk show in COP27? It's for us as a continent to make use of our African group of negotiators to negotiate those silent issues that surround the loss and damage, climate finance, and adaptation issue.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olumide. And Stephen, just before we wrap things up, they say charity begins at home, and we've seen the way Africa was treated in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic and vaccine rollout. Now, what can Africans do as a continent and a people to tackle climate change? And if you can, in less than a minute, because we're fast running out of time. Thank you.
Well, I think it has to start with governments putting in place clear climate change strategies at the national level and at the provincial and local levels. And there has to be harmonization between your different government sectors. That also brings on board the private sector and it takes into consideration all the facets of climate change impacts, not just on our economy, but on our agricultural systems, on our environment, and on communities themselves.
Stephen Buchanan-Clarke, Olumide, thank you very much. Olumide Idowu, thank you very much for being a part of today's conversation. We do appreciate your insights on the subject.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
You're watching News Central Television. We'll go on a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be looking at the situation in Zambia, where opposition politician has spent a few days in jail for criticizing President Hakainde Hichilema. We'll be looking at all of this in detail when we return. Do stay with us.